Welcome back. We are turning to the last of the four major life cycle events marked in Jewish culture. And as I joked last time, it's not graduation from high school, graduation from college, graduation from university, graduate school, and getting your professional certification. People sometimes joke that's the Jewish life cycle. But in fact, it's the birth, the arrival of a child, traditionally marked by circumcision, now by a gender-neutral baby naming welcoming event. We have the coming of age ceremony, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, now also the gender neutral term b mitzvah is in currency, or brit mitzvah, covenant of mitzvah. Last week we talked about marriages and partnerships and celebrating weddings, including a little bit on the topic of intermarriage, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later in the class, but we didn't have the time to get into the complexities of that issue in Jewish life today, which of course is a very important one. And today we're talking about funerals. As we've highlighted in every one of these classes, these life cycle events are not uniquely Jewish. They are human. They're part of every culture in the world. And many cultures have a birth ritual, a coming of age ritual, a partnership marriage ritual, and many cultures mark death rituals. In fact, we found archaeological evidence that Neanderthals may have even marked death rituals in some ways. We found some Neanderthal skeletons that were purposefully buried in certain ways with certain objects with them. And we know in human culture going back 30, 40,000 years, we have intentional burials. Sometimes they were buried with seashells that come from thousands of miles away from where they were living. So this was a very intentional act where they actually took something of value and left it with the body for whatever purpose they imagined that to be. So death is a part of the human experience, and marking death is a part of human culture going back long before we have written or oral records. So since we actually have critical mass in the class today, instead of only one or two people signing in, I thought maybe I'll open up by asking, why do you think it is that human beings feel a need to mark death in some way?
Because we find it scary, and we also don't like when people we like are no longer there.
Okay, so we miss people that are gone, and we're a little bit afraid of what happens. Any other thoughts? Yeah,
Just
Lori,
say goodbye.
Oh, saying goodbye, Rhonda, right? That emotional need to sort of let go, for sure. Lori?
I think it also has to do with a conception of the world as being a continuum with the unknown. So, you know, for example, in African cultures or in American Indian cultures, there's this idea that the ancestors are there all the time and they're participating in life. And it's important to mark these things correctly, because if you don't do things correctly, they come back and haunt you, or they can make your kids sick, a whole lot of things like that. But it's hard for us, I think, to understand how important it was for in cultures that were not Christian, Jewish, Islamic, how important it was to understand that ancestors are part and parcel of your everyday life, and you interact with them. And so this part of this ritual of passing is very important.
There was a fascinating piece in National Geographic, I want to say maybe 18 months ago or so, about these communities in the Philippines that don't bury their dead. They simply like set them up in their living room, and they become sort of mummified bodies there. So they're actually still present. And if you tried to talk to them about the empty chair at the table at the holiday meal, they would say, what are you talking about? Grandma's right there. They're still there as part of you. Or they're living on the mantelpiece, whether it's in an urn or, in some other kind of talisman focus. Any other thoughts on why we, as human beings, mark death?
I think it's one of those things that's so hard for us to conceptualize. I think it's a very difficult thing to wrap your head around, impermanence in that way. And so probably, different cultures at different times come up with ways to explain it. And just to humans, we're always seeking explanations, and when we don't know, we make it up. So I think that's, yeah.
Sure. I mean, there are people who never get past the stage of thinking the world revolves around themselves, right? And then to imagine the whole world running without you seems really inconceivable. And I think some of it also has to do with our conception of ourselves. We're an odd duck because we have this physical form, but we also have a whole world of mind that doesn't have tangible reality in the way that our senses and our external body does. And so it's not ridiculous to imagine that there's something in you that is not of you, you know, whether it's a spirit or a soul or some other kind of consciousness. And to envision that ending seems both tragic and, as Kate said, inconceivable. And so to have a cosmology, a sense of the world, that there is part of you that is eternal, that goes beyond the physical body, then leads to all kinds of rituals around death, because that marks a transition in that stage of life. You know, it's like the butterfly stopping the caterpillar stage and going on to something else. That if caterpillars had culture, they might have marked that. And it's not clear whether they would have marked that as a coming of age ritual or as a death and rebirth ritual, right? So we can imagine human culture processing the death of our consciousness in a similar way. Now, I mean, we who take a more secular and humanistic approach to life generally take the approach that death is the end. You know, our consciousness is based on electrical signals in our brain. And when our heart stops pumping blood and getting oxygen to the brain eventually dies, eventually in like 3-4 minutes. I mean, we're not talking a long time. And when those signals stop, that's the end of us as we knew it. And we can talk about ideas of natural immortality and living on in legacy and so on. But in the end, the harsh answer that the atheist Madeleine Murray O'Hair gave on a talk show once is still true. They asked her, well, if you don't believe in a heaven or hell, what happens when you die? And she said, you rot. Now, there are much more comforting answers than that. But on some crass, you know, tangible level, if you are your body, that body decomposes. It becomes the atoms of the earth, as even Epicurus talked about centuries ago. And you are no more. But Epicurus's answer to that challenge was not fear, but to say, don't worry. He said, you were not before you existed. You simply didn't exist. There was nothing. And when you're gone, you also won't be anymore. So don't worry about an afterlife, and don't worry about judgment or what the gods think of you, or you just won't be anymore. And there's nothing to fear from that. So that's why Epicurus's perspective was make the most of this life, you know, enjoy time while you can. And the funny thing is, in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes that gets parodied as the dumb answer. So the foolish people in the book of Kings, it said, are the ones who say, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And I actually suggested that would make a great t-shirt for humanistic Jews, like in Hebrew and English. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, because that's the point. This is the life that we have and that we know. And so that's why marking death is important, but living life is important too. And so that's our philosophy of it. So let's take a journey through the history of Jewish observance of death rituals, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how we can approach those ourselves. Now, Jewish culture historically has been a burial culture. And when Sherwin Wine would teach this topic, he divides human cultures into 3 categories. There was always a certain number of categories for him. The first one is a burial culture, where the goal is to put the body in the ground. And it might be right away, it might be after a few days, but ultimately that's where bodies go. The second is a cremation culture, where when the person dies, you consume the body in flame, and maybe you save the ashes, and maybe you dump the ashes somewhere special. You think of Hinduism as a cremation culture. There are certainly many others. But then there's a third category, and these are exposure cultures, where you simply expose the body to the natural elements. And that could be, you know, putting them on a platform in nature. That could be putting them in special burial mounds where the vultures come in. I mean, in some cultures, the sky is where people belong. And so the birds come and they take the body to the sky. And that's the solution to dealing with the body. My brother-in-law had a fourth option. He said, just dump me in the woods. And then about 10 years ago, there was a funeral home in Georgia that had been accused of claiming to cremate people, but actually giving them like quick concrete instead of the ashes and just dumping the bodies in the woods. So we sent him a link for that article. We said, we found the funeral home for you. Solve the problem. But in general, that's a subset of exposure, right? So Jewish culture was a burial culture. It was put the body in the ground. And you can even see that in the very earliest sources that talk about human mortality, which goes back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, where you have the story of Adam and Eve. One second, there we go. The story of Adam and Eve, where Eve eats from the tree and they are going to die as God warned them. Of course, before they ate from the tree, they didn't know what death was. So I'm not sure that there was a meaningful threat. But in any case, they are now to die, having eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so Adam's curse is that he has to work the ground to all the days of his life. And at the end, you say, you have the last verse, in the sweat of your face, you will eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you return. And this makes extra sense in the Hebrew because the word Adam for human is related to the word Adamah, which means earth. So from the earth, from the Adamah, the Adam came. And that's part of the narrative of how he's formed from the clay of the ground and the breath of life is breathed into him. So the idea that we are connected to the earth is part of the rationale given for why Jews bury. Okay. It also has to do with climate. In some areas, you could simply put the body in the desert and it would desiccate and become mummified, as happened in Egypt, as happened in Peru. There also is a whole tradition of mummifying there. But in Jewish culture, you would often bury them, but sometimes the burial would take 2 stages. So you would put them into like the cavern where the families would be buried. You'd basically have the body in a kind of exposure setting. And then there's a phrase that appears multiple times in the Bible that they were gathered to their ancestors. And what that meant was you would actually go back to where the body had been laid in that particular cave after the flesh had decomposed, and you would gather the bones together and put them in a bone box. The fancy term for a bone box is an ossuary. And we see examples of ossuaries as part of Canaanite culture and in other stages in Jewish life. So that idea of being gathered to your fathers sometimes wasn't a metaphor for simply joining the ancestors, as Lori was saying. It's actually physically your bones are being gathered and put together with your ancestors' bones in the long-term storage place. You'll also see that one of the ways they made vibrant the need to bury quickly was the definition of a dead body as impure. And anybody who touches the dead body becomes impure. Now, impurity does not mean evil. Sometimes you're required to deal with dead bodies. So you intentionally make yourself impure. But in the Bible, what impurity means is touching something from the supernatural realm if you're in this realm, and sort of crossing that line. So actually the high priest who goes and offers sacrifices becomes unclean and has to purify himself after the sacrifices because he's crossed that boundary. And the dead body has definitely crossed over to that other side. So you see in Numbers chapter 19, whoever touches the dead body shall be unclean for 7 days. He purifies himself on the 3rd day. By the 7th day, he's clean. Whoever touches the dead body of any man who is dead and does not purify himself defiles the tabernacle. His soul will be cut off. His uncleanness stays on him. And so if he offers sacrifices in a state of uncleanness, now he's crossing the boundary when he's impure, and now he's really up the creek. So even when a person dies in a tent, all those who come into the tent are unclean for 7 days. Every open utensil without a covering on it is unclean. Anyone who touches someone slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or the bone of a man, or even a grave, shall be unclean for 7 days. So clearly there's a taboo, right, around the dead body, that they are simply not to be touched and not to be left around. If you're leaving a dead body around for 7 days, think of all the impurities you could produce. Much better get it in the ground, out of the way, and mark it with a stone so people know what not to step on. Right? So you have your special space marked. And as the body is put into the ground, there's also a sense of a kind of underworld in the Hebrew Bible. Now, it's not a hell. That shows up much later in Jewish thought. It's more like the Greek concept of Hades. And this is Hades before they had the Elysian field sort of heaven parallel. This is the original Hades. There's a famous scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus goes down to Hades in his wanderings around, and he meets Achilles, who's down there, and he thinks, boy, Achilles, you must be living the life down here because you were the most famous hero who lived up to the great ideals of Greek heroism. And Achilles says, I would rather be a servant of the lowest kind on earth than king in Hades. Hades stinks. You are a ghost of a shade. You don't do anything. Nothing happens to you. It's an afterlife, but it's not a positive afterlife. Again, think of the imagery of the boat keeper. We have to pay your 2 coins to cross the boat. He's made of a skeleton. I mean, this is not a cheerful place, right? You have the spirits who take your spirit, and that's where you live. And maybe you can have some rituals to appease the spirits afterwards. There's certainly a concept in Islamic culture of what's called the jinn or the genie, the kind of evil spirits that are floating around. And there's certainly traditions of Jewish amulet culture as well to deal with evil spirits. In fact, the character Lilith in the Hebrew Bible doesn't really appear as a character, but is referred to obliquely in the prophets, and Lilith in rabbinic literature becomes a demon who tries to steal men's seed at night, thus causing nocturnal emissions and sin and impurity, and also kill children in their cradles, explaining crib death. But again, seen to be a kind of evil spirit that is certainly in the air in this time and place. And you see an example of this in the book of Samuel, where Saul wants to communicate with the prophet the prophet Solomon. No, the prophet Samuel. Excuse me, I got my S's mixed up. So King Saul wants to talk to the prophet Samuel, who has died. And so he goes to look for a medium, a machashefa, a woman who can talk to the dead, which he has banned, by the way. And so he disguises himself and goes to visit this woman. And he says, please divine for me by a spirit, bring him up for me, the one I named to you. She warns him, Saul has gotten rid of all those things. And in the Torah, which is probably written after Saul, but is sort of an editorial strand on this, that they're clearly banned. You do not talk to the dead. You do not try to communicate with them at all. And Saul promises you won't be punished. He says, bring up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and she spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? You're Saul. And he said, do not be afraid. What did you see? He doesn't even see the spirit, but she sees the spirit because she has a special gift. I saw a godlike man ascending from the earth, she says. What is his appearance? An old man comes up. He is covered with a mantle. Saul perceived it was Samuel. He stooped with his face to the ground, and he bowed. And Samuel said to Saul, why have you bothered me by bringing me up? This is like what your grandpa would say if you call him too early in the morning, right? Why have you bothered me by bringing me up? And Saul answered and said, I'm distressed. The Philippines war against me. I don't get any dreams. I called you to let me know what to do. So here you have this scene of bringing the body up, or the spirit up, after the body's been buried, and trying to see it again. Now, there's a lot of theories about where this concept of some kind of spirit afterlife comes from. Some speculate it might be because we still dream about people who have died. And where does that come from? It must be some kind of spirit world they're trying to communicate from. It could also be that fear of death or the permanence of loss, and we don't want to admit it, so we deny it in some ways. And there's also the fear that those spirits coming back might not be so happy. And so there are traditions of ripping the clothing or even marring the body. Sometimes the Torah says, do not cut your hair or cut your face for the dead, which evidently is something people were doing. And there's a sense that if your spirits of your dead come back, they shouldn't see you too happy, right? Because that doesn't look good. So instead, they try to make you look miserable and feel miserable, so that if they're coming back, they won't see you living it up. This again gets extended into rabbinic practice, as we'll see in a moment. It's clear in the biblical legislation that body preservation, Egyptian-style mummification, is generally prohibited, although Joseph himself in Egypt is mummified so they can bring him back to the land of Israel and bury him there, which is one of his last requests. But in general, mummification, preserving the body, is prohibited. The goal is for it to break down. And they also want to avoid any worship of the dead. There's very clearly a sense that the dead are not gods. They are not spirits to be worshipped. There's only one person to be worshipped by the time the Torah is finally compiled, let's say around 500 BCE, and that is the Hebrew God. But it's very clear, if you read the Torah, there is no sort of personal afterlife to be found, certainly no personal resurrection that appears in the Hebrew Bible, other than one passage in the book of Daniel. There is a passage in Ezekiel where he sees some dead bones that get up and like dance around again. You know that song, Dem Bones, Dem Bones? That's based on that Ezekiel passage, but that's really imagining a national resurrection. It's only in the book of Daniel, in chapter 12 of Daniel, actually, where he says explicitly that those who slumber will rise again and be personally resurrected. I mean, it's very clear in Daniel. But that's a very, very late book in the Hebrew canon, probably written closer to 180 to 160 BCE. In the Torah itself, those first 5 books and the books of the prophets, generally divine punishment and reward is in this life, and there's no other place for it to happen. But of course, that leads to problems, because if you believe that you're only going to be rewarded or punished in this life, and you're rewarded or punished based on following the commandments, what happens if you're persecuted for your religion, as happened during the Maccabean persecution? There you had people who were circumcising and were following the kosher laws and were studying Torah, and they were being persecuted precisely because of what they were doing. Precisely because they were following the commandments, they were suffering more. And so this creates a cognitive dissonance that needs to be resolved if you want to maintain your faith in the system. And the way people managed to maintain their faith in the system was by coming up with an afterlife resolution. If you suffer here and now, you're burning off your sins, but your reward will be found in the world to come. There's actually an article of faith in the Mishnah, the first collection of rabbinic teachings that was compiled around the year 200 of the Common Era. So that's taking teachings from the previous 400 years and collecting them by that time. And it says explicitly that you have no share in the world to come if you don't believe the Torah is from heaven, if you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead being in the Torah, or if you're an apikoros. If you're paying attention in the first part of class, you might recognize apikoros. It sounds a bit like Epicurus, that Greek philosopher we mentioned, who said, don't be afraid of death. Now, believing the Torah is not from heaven, that would be challenging the rabbinic interpretation, but also the concept that this text is divine. And not believing the resurrection of the dead is to be found in the Torah, well, then it makes sense. You shouldn't get any resurrection if you don't believe it's there. If you don't believe in the promise, why should you get the payoff? However, it isn't there. If you read the Talmud's discussion of that Mishnah passage, that early teaching, the later rabbinic explanations of it, they try to find a source in the Torah that proves that it is in fact in the Torah, and none of their proofs are really that convincing. The best they find is Daniel, which of course is late and is explicit, but all the other sources are taking like the verb tense of a particular thing and saying, well, he will find his reward in the land of Israel. Well, that means in the world to come. Now, the reason why I'm spending this much time on the rabbinic concept of a world to come is that there are a lot of Jews out there today who think Judaism doesn't believe in an afterlife. Judaism has always been all about this world. And the plain truth is that's just not true. In fact, there has for a long time been a belief in a Jewish afterlife, dating from the close of the biblical canon with Daniel, but certainly in rabbinic Judaism. They very clearly believed in a resurrection of the dead. There's even debates in the Talmud over, are the dead resurrected naked or do they have clothes on? Are they resurrected with amputated limbs or, incomplete? If you're resurrected and both of your wives are resurrected, which one do you wind up with? I mean, they have to debate these questions because they really are believing in a physical resurrection of the dead. You can find it in the Amidah, the standing prayer blessing that's part of every Shabbat service and every daily service as well. There are different versions of it. They include the Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. Maimonides included it in his 13 articles of faith that every good Jew should believe. I believe with perfect faith in the resurrection of the dead. So it very clearly was part of Jewish law and practice. The reason why many Jews today think it wasn't is that in the 19th century, the Reform movement decided that was icky, or that it wasn't civilized to believe in a physical resurrection. That seems odd, like spiritual immortality, your soul becoming part of the ocean of God. Okay, fine. But physical resurrection with the body? Ugh. They also decided that the judgment time concept didn't make sense to them either. But what's hilarious about that, if you read the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform of Reform Judaism, which we talked about a bit in the history class, they say explicitly, we reject as not rooted in Judaism the concepts of Gan Eden and Gehenna. They use the Hebrew terms for Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, paradise, and Gehenna, the valley of death, of the Gehenom, which is outside of Jerusalem, aka the pit of fire where you go to burn for your sins, which is described in rabbinic literature. But they've decided those were imports from some other culture. They're not part of the core of Judaism, and so we can expel them, even though they use the Jewish terms for them. But because they started teaching Judaism doesn't believe in an afterlife, and frankly, many Jews got secularized and didn't actually believe in that kind of personal afterlife, they decided Judaism doesn't, and so they go around saying Jews don't believe in an afterlife, when the plain fact of the matter is they historically did, and many of them do today. Okay, so enough of my high horse about Jewish afterlife. There was, in fact, the concept of a Jewish afterlife that I don't believe in, but at least it's there historically. So there was definitely a concept of a judgment time where you could wind up in Gan Eden, the paradise, or Gehenna, the underworld. There was a concept of ha-olam haba, the world to come, which was that time after judgment and resurrection. And death itself was seen as a kind of judgment. The traditional phrase that one is expected to recite after a person has died is Baruch Dayan Emet. Blessed is the true judge. even if they died horribly unjustly, you still are supposed to affirm, blessed is the true judge. You even find examples of this reliance on an afterlife in some of the core prayers of the funeral ritual of Rabbinic Judaism. So look at the bottom here, where you have this prayer called Elmalei Rakhmi, God full of mercy. God full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence and the lofty levels of the holy and pure for so-and-so, son of so-and-so, who went to his world or his eternity. I will give charity for the remembrance of his soul. May his resting place be the Garden of Eden. May the Master of Mercy shelter him in the shelter of his wings, and may he bind his soul in the bond of life. And at the end we say Amen. So here's a prayer looking for the person to be redeemed. And in the Middle Ages, around the same time that the Catholic Church is selling indulgences to buy your relatives' way into heaven even after they've died, rabbis come up with the idea that if you recite the Kaddish for somebody who's died, that can also earn them points and help minimize their purgatory period, so to speak. Even if they didn't have that category purgatory, but it would get them rewards even afterwards. So this concept in Rabbinic Judaism shows up probably as a borrowing from Catholic theology at the same time. There's an interesting scholarly study on this. Now, when the person died, there was clearly a desire to treat the body with respect. This concept of the kavod hamet, honoring the dead. So I just want to do this. We have the tradition of having the body washed by a special community called the Chevra Kaddish, the Holy Society, put into a special shroud called a kittel, which is a white robe that is actually used when you're alive too. For Passover, you would wear it. When you were married, you would wear it. And when you're buried in it. And I think on Yom Kippur also in many communities, you wear that white robe too. So it is a ceremonial robe to be used, but also becomes an important role for your death. And it's important to not leave the body alone. There's always somebody attending the body, often reciting psalms or other kind of prayers for them. However, that person can't be a priest, a Kohen, because remember, the dead body defiles, right? And it defiles in a closed space. Well, if you're a Kohen, a priest, you always have to be ready in case the temple gets rebuilt in the next 15 minutes. So you can't intentionally get yourself impure. So I've even heard a story about a rabbi who was a Kohen who would give his eulogies from the parking lot. He couldn't be in the same room as the body for the eulogy for a funeral, so he would have to do it in another room or even outside of the building to avoid the possibility of becoming impure. I see a couple hands up. So first, yeah. Kate had her hand up, and then let me go to Rhonda second.
Yeah, real quick. I wanted to just ask, I totally believe that in Rabbinic Judaism, there's this idea of heaven and hell and an afterlife and reward and punishment. What's the likelihood that some of that came from their Christian neighbors? Like, what was the Christian idea of heaven and hell? Like, now we're in rabbinic times and we're living. Well, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yes. So a couple of things. One is you have to remember there's almost 300 years of rabbinic thought before Christianity exists. Right. Because rabbinic thought starts around 200 BCE, and the Christian church doesn't start writing its gospels till the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. Okay. So you got about 300 years of rabbinic thought percolating. Okay. Also, many speculate that this afterlife idea begins to develop during the Maccabean persecution, which again is in the 2nd century BCE. Okay. Third, a lot of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls community include this concept of afterlife and Judgment Day and the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. This is thought to be a strain in Jewish thought called the Essenes, which leads to Christianity. The Christians borrow a lot of ideas from the Essenes. So when you're talking about a Christian afterlife, you're really talking about a version of a Jewish afterlife that Christians borrowed and then developed in their own way. That's really part of the challenge in evaluating who got what from whom. Even the stuff that Christians claim is Christian and that Jews didn't become part of mainstream rabbinic Judaism were part of pre-rabbinic Christian split Judaism. Gotcha. And there's speculation actually that Jews got this afterlife concept from the East, from the Zoroastrian tradition or other kind of Eastern religions that they were influenced by that way. So I would say it's more likely Christians got their afterlife from Jews than the other way around. So Rhonda and then Lori.
Yeah, I kind of missed what you were saying about the Cohens, because like my mother was a Cohen and her father, and actually my great grandfather was a scribe. So what were you saying
Okay.
that's different about them, or
Right.
that
So
they?
two things. One is the tribe goes from the father. So if your mother was a Cohen but married a not Cohen, then her kids weren't Cohens. So you don't have to worry.
Okay.
Um,
No, I was
I know.
just curious what it meant, because
The second is the Cohen is the priest, right? They're expected to become priests when the temple is rebuilt in the Messianic era. And so they have to be ready to fulfill their service as priests on a moment's notice, because who knows, the Messiah might come any moment and magically rebuild the temple right away. And so they shouldn't intentionally defile themselves. Now, sometimes they have to, right? Their parent dies, they have to close the eyes, fine. They have sex, right? They menstruate. I mean, you know, these things happen. And then they have to go and purify themselves when possible. But you shouldn't intentionally impurify yourself by being with a dead body when there's another way to do it. So you wouldn't, for example, volunteer for the Chevra Kaddish to wash the bodies, because that would be intentionally getting yourself impure when you're a Cohen and you're not supposed to do that. So you may have seen a picture on social media of this person flying on an airplane wrapped in a plastic bag, like their whole body was wrapped in a plastic bag. It was because they were worried they might fly over a cemetery and they were a Cohen, and they were told this would sort of keep them away from the impurity of being in a cemetery. Now, this is an offshoot or a radical sect. I don't want to tar all of Jewish thought with that radicalism. But in general, this concept of the Cohen not impurifying themselves with the body has broad purchase in the Orthodox Jewish world.
And is it also true that only men can be a Cohen?
Well, certainly only men would work in the temple. I mean, and they would only be the ones that would give the priestly blessing in the synagogue with the special hand gesture, which is where
Well, that's why
Leonard
I'm
Nimoy got
asking.
it from. This is the priestly blessing gesture, which may have some connection to goats. We don't really know. There's all sort of interesting theories
Jewish.
about that. And he is Jewish. That's where he got it from. I mean, he borrowed it from that blessing. But again, women wouldn't do that because they wouldn't be leading prayers in the synagogue or offering those blessings.
No.
So yeah, I mean, women could have some of the Cohen rules, but they couldn't pass down Cohen status.
Well, I'm specifically, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just, before you go on and on, it was really just a specific question, because there was this, I don't know, conversation or controversy when my mother passed away, that about having the hands on the stone.
Right.
And because she was a woman, but yet my sister seemed to know that she wanted that. And so we did it. But was that wrong?
I don't care.
No, but I'm just, you know what I mean,
know.
according to,
I mean, this is what you're asking for is an Orthodox ruling, which I'm not qualified to give. So I don't know the subtleties of the rulings of who gets what symbols on their stones. I mean, there's also a Levite symbol. I don't know if women could get those or not. And, some of it is Orthodox law, and some of it is, gender prejudice, and that gets in the way. Okay, let's Lori, and then let's move on because we've got a lot more to cover.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one quick thing. I've actually been reading the entire book of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and most of them date back to 120 to 0 sort of BCE. So it predates the Christian stuff, and it's interesting. A number of the things that are in there sort of it sounds like Paul. I mean, it comes really, so stuff that's in the Gospels, and this stuff is being clearly written before the Gospels. So it's really interesting to see the echoes of some of the Christian thought coming out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are clearly predating that. So just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. Yeah. We always look at history backwards, like from our perspective, and imagine it was always that way, and we have to read it the other way.
Yeah.
It takes a little more practice. Okay, so what happens when the person dies? Well, in rabbinic thought, you do actually have a formal tearing of the clothing as part of that funeral ritual. And what that's evolved to in modern funeral homes is they pin something on you, so you're wearing it, and then they tear the ribbon. But if you go to more Orthodox communities, my father, when he went for his mother's funeral, they ripped his shirt. I mean, you rip the real thing as an outward demonstration of your mourning. And again, to make yourself look pitiable, because judgment is in the air. It's the same reason why you don't wash or shave for Yom Kippur. If God is going to judge you, you are throwing yourself on the mercy of the court and pre-punishing yourself. I sometimes analogize it to NCAA teams that are caught cheating, who voluntarily vacate with victories and give back money and awards and stuff, as if they're going to pre-punish themselves out of any other punishment. That's the same kind of idea with Yom Kippur, and to some extent with the mourning process of having to go through the Shiva rituals and tearing the clothing. But remember, Shiva goes on for longer than just the funeral. You have the tearing for the funeral process. You also have a tradition of offering what's called in Hebrew a hesped, or a eulogy, where you do actually talk about the dead person and who they were, or at least who they were fit for public consumption. There's sort of a tradition of spinning things for the best. You don't say he was a terrible person and nobody liked him and he never gave any charity. And you talk about how wonderful they were. There's a nice Yiddish saying that all brides are beautiful and all the dead are frum, are holy. Alle Kalas seinen schön, alle Mason seinen frum is the Yiddish that all brides are beautiful and all the dead were holy, because we're not gonna speak ill of them after they're gone. Now I'm sort of stuck because I want to tell the truth, but sometimes they were jerks and the family doesn't want to tell me that, or they don't want me to say that in front of everybody. So you have to find the art of spin. The example I often use is if someone was a very critical person, I'll say, well, they had high standards, or they pushed you to excel, right? And so the family knows what I'm talking about when you say that, but for the audience who might not have known them as intimately, it sounds respectable. So that's the kind of tightrope you sometimes have to walk with the eulogy part. But it is nice that Jewish tradition has this concept of telling the story of the person and who they were and what they did in life, and that's a value. There's a tradition of a special processional. It's called the levaya, literally like the carrying of the coffin or the body, if it was not with a coffin at all. And it's a procession of family and friends that go basically from the house to the cemetery, or from the funeral home to the cemetery these days. And now we use cars, but again, in a much earlier era where things were not at great distance, it could be a simple walking processional. Traditionally, the people carrying the casket would not be the closest relatives. They might be grandkids, they might be spouses of people who were mourning, but not necessarily the intimate mourners. In fact, there was a definition of who were the closest mourners. The onen is the term for the official mourner who's required to sit Shiva, to sit that 7-day period. I'll also point out that nowadays, again, looking backwards, we talk about sitting Shiva for 3 days or sitting Shiva for 2 days. The word Shiva comes from the number Sheva, which means 7. So it's sort of odd, like we're sitting 7 for 3 days, but that's the way life is these days. And frankly, in many cases, you've done your Shiva before the person dies, because you're doing a vigil in the last days in the hospital. So it becomes a sort of odd experience to try and do 7 more days afterwards. But this concept of Shiva is technically only obligatory on 7 close relations, who the rabbis decided are the closest relations. And they are mother, father, son, daughter, brother, sister, or spouse. Those are the 7 categories that have to sit the 7 days of Shiva. And there are a number of rules, again, to make you miserable. You have to sit on low chairs. You have to cover the mirrors so you can't take pleasure in your appearance. You have to not shave if you're a man, not to wear makeup or extra jewelry. And you're not really supposed to leave the house very much. That's one of the reasons why there's a tradition of having a minyan of people to pray come to you, so you don't have to leave the home. And people bring you food, so you don't have to leave the home. I mean, it has a nice sort of psychological comfort function these days, because you get to rest and people are coming to you. And sometimes it's stressful to entertain all these people when you're not in a really entertaining mood. You're also not technically supposed to talk directly to the family about the dead person, which is probably the most broken law in Jewish life, because when you show up at a Shiva, that's what you do. But traditionally, you were supposed to sort of sit silently and let the mourners lead the conversation. And if they want to talk about the dead person, they could lead with that, but they could talk about the sports teams, they could talk about the weather. It doesn't matter. You're there for your presence, not for your talking. And so there's some deep wisdom in that. The idea of surrounding you with people at a time when you feel like you have a big absence in your life. It doesn't fill the hole of the person that's gone, but you surround it with loving people, and that can be a positive thing. The person is supposed to be buried usually within 24 hours. This is again from a culture where if you left the body out, it would become a health hazard and problem. But also there's a tradition of getting the body in their permanent rest. Traditionally, actually, in some places, there are no coffins used. In Israel, for example, they're buried just in the shroud in the ground. That's if you went to a burial in Israel, you would see that. In this country, there's a tradition of using coffins, often a plain coffin, but sometimes more ornate. And in some states, because of the water table, they have to put it into a concrete vault and then seal it. And that's more of a technical issue than a legalistic halakha issue. There's also a tradition of having them touch earth, even if their body isn't actually in the ground, it's in a casket of some kind. You still take a little bit of earth from the Mount of Olives or from the land of Israel more generally and put that on the grave. In fact, there's an interesting anecdote. When Menachem Begin, the right-wing prime minister of Israel, died in the 1980s, he insisted that he be buried on the Mount of Olives cemetery, which was a historic Jewish cemetery in East Jerusalem. And it was a Jewish cemetery that went back several centuries. A number of his Irgun, revolutionary colleagues were buried there. And so he said he wanted to be buried with them. It also had the political side of being in East Jerusalem. So it was almost as if he was making a statement, you're going to give this back to them over my dead body, literally, because that's where he and his wife are buried. But that idea of having contact with the land of Israel applies even in diaspora. And sometimes a person's most prized possession would be a little bit of earth from the land of Israel that they would then be buried with, and that would connect them to their ancestors. One of the interesting questions asked in the Talmud and later literature is, well, there's supposed to be a resurrection of the dead, right? Well, where does that start? Well, of course, it starts in Jerusalem. And we're in Jerusalem. Well, of course, the Mount of Olives. That's what that makes sense. So people would sometimes move to Israel to be buried on the Mount of Olives, so they'd be first in line. But then, of course, the question arises, well, what about the people that aren't buried in Israel? How do they get there? And they imagine there are underground tunnels, and they sort of roll their way over and then pop up on the Mount of Olives. I mean, again, I'm mocking this as being kind of primitive and ridiculous, but these are questions people, if they believed in a physical resurrection of the dead, they needed to ask these kind of questions because inquiring minds wanted to know. Okay, so I mentioned the 7 days of mourning for those 7 close relations, but there's another set of mourning rituals to be followed for 30 days. These are called the Shloshim. And there's even a 12-month period if it's your parents who died, because there's 2 principles there. There's honoring the dead and honor your mother and father. So if it's your parent that dies, you take the 7 and apply it for 30. And you take the 30 and apply it for a full year. So I think not shaving, for example, is a 30-day thing. But if it's your parent, you don't shave for a full year. And it becomes, part of your public mourning ritual. And after that 12-month period, or sometime around the end of that 12-month period, you would unveil the headstone or the stone marking their grave as a formal ritual. As I mentioned, the rabbis wanted to avoid worshiping the dead, as was commonly practiced in other cultures around them. So they did not allow flowers to be put on the grave. That felt like a kind of offering, just like giving food to the dead and so on. But they did allow you to bring stones to leave a stone on the grave. And you could find interesting stuff trying to explain why the stone and how it lasts longer and how it's a sign of personal presence. It's like, I forget what they call those when you stack up stones along a trail to show that people have been there. I forget what those things are called, but it's, again, a sign of human presence or habitation.
Cairn.
Cairn, right, there you go. Right, good Jewish term. No, but it's the same kind of principle. On the tombstone, again, you might have some symbols like the Cohen symbol or a Levite symbol. Generally, you'd have their name, son of so-and-so, the dates of their death in the Hebrew calendar. And you'll often see a set of Hebrew letters, Taf, Nun, Sadi, Beit, Hey. And that's an acronym for a Hebrew phrase, Tehei Nishmata or Nishmato, Tzirura B'tzror HaChayim. May her soul or his soul be bound in the bond of life, literally eternal life. So again, an affirmation of immortality, even on the tombstone in that traditional affirmation. Now, what many people associate with mourning is a text called the Kaddish. Now, there are actually many versions of the Kaddish. One is called the Rabbi's Kaddish or the Scholar's Kaddish. There's a half Kaddish, there's a full Kaddish. And if you go to a traditional service, you'll hear this rhythm of the Kaddish, Yit Kadal, Yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah. You'll hear it over and over again because it's part of the ritual of the regular prayer service. And it says nothing about death because it's a praise of God. Now, the mourner's Kaddish is applied to those who are mourning, and that's what you would hear at a funeral. But because most Jews don't go to services weekly, they only think of the Kaddish as connected to funerals because that's where they hear. And again, if you were from an Ashkenazi background, you wouldn't have heard Yit Kadal v'Yit Kadash. You would have heard Yiskadal v'Yiskadash because that T becomes an S, like Shabbat becomes Shabbos. Same idea. But you can see if you look at the text here, again, there's nothing about death. It's all praise to God. Glorified and sanctified be God's name throughout the world he has created. And you say, Amen. May his great name be blessed forever and for all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored, adored and lauded be the name of the Holy. I mean, I'd be embarrassed to get a speech like this at my retirement event. This is really flattery here. But this is part of the traditional liturgy. And theologically, it's the affirmation of faith in the face of a loss. And it's seen to be as comforting because it's affirming that your life and your living connection of faith with the God of Israel continues even after this loss, just like you say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge, after the loss, again, affirming your faith in tradition. It's traditional that the last Kaddish in the service would be recited by the mourners. And there's even the translation of this into a noun, because Kaddish would generally be recited for you on the anniversary of your death, in Yiddish, your Yartzeit, or your year time, by your oldest male descendant. Be firstborn son, or the oldest son living. And if you did not have any sons, it could be your nephew, it could be someone else who's like a cousin. And you would even refer to that person as, he's my Kaddish. He's the one who's going to be reciting this for me after I'm gone. Part of it is to be remembered. Part of it is that, again, that medieval concept that it can help you in your judgment process through the afterlife. But clearly there is a sense of, the importance of having a legacy like that. And as I alluded to, there's a tradition of marking the death even beyond that 12-month period. In Yiddish, we have this concept of a Yartzeit, a year anniversary of their death, when you would light a candle that would burn for 24 hours. There are also candles lit during the Shiva process, of course. And at special events, you would have memorials. For example, at Yom Kippur, there's a Yizkor service near the end of the day of Yom Kippur, which means he will remember. In humanistic context, we often shift that a bit and say Nizkor, we will remember, which is more the point for us. But the concept of having the important times of life include some memory of people who are gone is something that that's continued in secular and humanistic communities as well. Okay, so what do we do with this? Well, we have a very different approach to what death is all about. We don't see it as a transition to a new stage of existence. We do see it as an opportunity to provide healing for the ones who were alive, but also to represent the values of the one who is gone. That is, it's a balancing act. And sometimes it's tricky, because you may have heard families sometimes don't get along or don't agree on everything. I did a funeral once where one of the children was secular and one of the children was Orthodox. And so we had to find a way that they both felt their needs would be met. And so what we did was, I did the main eulogy. The husband of, they were both daughters, the husband of the Orthodox daughter read the Elmalei Rakhmi prayer at the funeral home before we went to the cemetery. And then their Orthodox rabbi did the graveside service. So they got the Kaddish and they got the lines of mourners, wishing them well, and all the traditions that were part of a traditional Orthodox funeral. So they could feel like they had an Orthodox interment, putting in the ground. But the secular partner felt like the person's life was celebrated the way she would have wanted to do it in the funeral home. But it's a balancing act. What if the person who died was secular and their kids are religious? Well, you need to, again, think about the needs of the living, but also think about the values and who the dead person was. We have to consider both. We can't simply do one or the other. If push comes to shove, maybe you lean toward the side of the living because, again, our perspective is the dead person won't know, but you still want to try to have some integrity in representing both. We also don't have to take you're in the ground and now the worms go in and the worms go out and talk about that at the funeral. we can talk about this natural immortality that you live on in the legacy of good works that you do. You live on in the impact you've had on people's lives, whether it's children or friends or family or community. You live on in the memories of people who are still alive. And that's the best we can hope for, is that natural immortality. The other thing that we have to do, and it's very important, is we have to affirm that sometimes this stinks. We have to give people permission to feel loss, to feel sad, to feel angry, to feel bereft. And there's a real power in affirming that for people and saying, you know, this car accident was a terrible thing. You get all kinds of totally unhelpful commentary that people will give you, like, oh, there was an angel shortage in heaven, so God had to take your child. Come on. Now, I serve people who agree with me on the afterlife question, and I serve people who might believe in some kind of afterlife. I don't impose my ideology on them, but I do believe that whether you or not you believe in an afterlife, if someone has died, you're not going to see them again in your lifetime. Even if there's some kind of reunion over the rainbow, you have to get used to the next 30, 50, 70 years of your life without them as part of your life. And so there is a mourning to that. And it's not helpful to deny the reality of that separation, be it temporary or be it permanent. So that's why I find affirming the reality of the loss, affirming the power of that separation is a very helpful and healthy thing to do. And most importantly, part of my job as leading these services is to help people see the big picture. It can be very hard when someone has just died, certainly after a long decline and illness, you know, cancer, dementia, who knows what. You know, science is a gift, and science is also a curse in its own way, because we keep people alive sometimes much longer than their brains last or their bodies last, and they suffer. You know, we don't always take the more we're sometimes more compassionate with our pets than we are with our people. But the reality is that often when you've had that kind of a long, painful decline, it's hard to see beyond that. You know, my grandmother, my spouse has gone through this decline, and all I can remember are those last days and weeks and the machines and the wires. And part of our job in creating a ceremony for them is to affirm the reality of their loss, but also to help them see the bigger picture. And I'll sometimes use the analogy of, if you were standing right next to a barn, all you could see is the barn. But if you step back 50 feet, if you step back 100 feet, the barn still looms large, but now you can see a little bit more of the landscape around it. And if you step back maybe 200 feet or 300 feet, the barn becomes still visible, but not the whole story. People don't choose how they die in most cases, and they certainly don't choose why they, you know, from what they die. But they make a lot of choices in how they live. And that's where I think the emphasis can be more profitably and more, you know, beneficially put in a secular and humanistic Jewish memorial service is on the story of their life. And that's why, you know, that eulogy part is the most important thing that we do. We tell the story of their life. Sometimes family wants to talk. That's great. Sometimes they don't want to talk. That's fine. You know, I'm like the stenographer. I take the stories and put them together. I try to hear as many stories as I can, because sometimes grandparents had very different relationships with grandkids than they did with their own children. You know, it's a different stage of life and a different kind of relationship. And I had one family where the kids really didn't have a great relationship with their mom, but the grandkids had a great relationship with their grandma, because she was just a different person, and she didn't have the responsibilities of parenting that she did 30 years before. So, you know, everyone has a different perspective on them. And that's part of the joy of those family meetings, sharing those stories. I find sometimes the sharing of the stories with the family is even more healing than the public memorial service, because that's when the family really gets to learn something about their loved one, or share the things that were most important to them. And it can really be a cathartic and a family bonding experience. So that's a very important part. And that's where I try not to delay it too much. You know, we're open to delaying the funeral if family has to get in town or there's other circumstances that come up. We're also open to cremation if that's something the family has chosen. Sometimes they'll donate the body to science, which means they're studied by medical schools and then cremated some months later when they're done. We don't need the remains to be there for the service, where traditionally you actually had the body in the coffin. Only the family got to see it, and then they closed the coffin for the public service, but the body was there. We're open to not having that. But I do suggest to families that putting off the memorial for 3 months maybe is not helping in that emotional processing stage, that it can be useful to at least start that process a little bit earlier, so that gives you some closure and you can start moving forward. Obviously with COVID, things are more complicated. I've done purely online funerals, actually, where everybody's in front of a computer everywhere. There's nobody in the room. And we've done others that are kind of hybrid with some people in person. I even did a hybrid outdoor cemetery stone unveiling, where I had to use my phone as a Wi-Fi hotspot and a portable camera and a portable microphone and broadcast the unveiling from the cemetery gravesite. But actually, a lot of funeral homes now are able to do that because they've had to, with COVID, they had to do things outside and they had to have people able to see it. So now, unfortunately, we're going to be doing this for the rest of our lives because people are going to always want to have that. And as I mentioned, the pre-Shiva, sometimes you come in to see the person before they die, and then you leave, and then they die, and you don't go back because you did your mourning, you did your processing with them there, and maybe you'll watch the funeral from a distance, but you're not going to fly back in from Belgium, from Japan, right? People are all over the world. So we have to be flexible to these new circumstances, and we have to be open to using this as an opportunity for the family to mourn in their own way. Sometimes it gets complicated. Maybe the family wants a traditional Kaddish that isn't something I would recite, but maybe someone else in the family would recite it, and that works. I have humanistic versions of the Kaddish I can show you, for example, and this is also in the course packet that's in the shared folder that we distribute with our weekly email and for those who sign up for the class. So here's a modern version of Kaddish by Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, which is more focused on those who are mourning. It's actually explicit about that in the last line, and instead of saying Amen, he has L'chaim. But there's also a more Hebrew style one that Sherwin Wine wrote that follows that Yitgadal v'Yitgadash, but instead of praising Shemei Rabbah, the great name, it praises Shlomo Ba'alma, peace in the world. And it praises peace. That's the focus of it. So it's all the same praise language, but now it's praising peace instead of praising God. And you can frame that as the peace that the person has found, the peace that we seek for ourselves. And in fact, wishing peace on the departed is part of a traditional Jewish phrase too. You would say about someone after they've died, so-and-so, Alav HaShalom or Aleha HaShalom, upon her be peace. May there be peace upon her. So peace is a core concept to that. The other sort of traditional reference to the dead is with a Zion and Alaman, or Zichrono Livracha, Zichrona Livracha, may their memory be a blessing. And that derives from a passage in the book of Proverbs, which says, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the memory of a righteous person is a blessing, which we use at Kol Hadash all the time as part of our memorial pieces. But the other thing that we can do is to show people there's plenty of other passages in world literature that might speak to the process of mourning and loss. After all, again, it's a human phenomenon. So here again, you have that Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the memory of a good person is a blessing. Yehuda Amachai is a beautiful poem called The Song of Praise, where again, he's not praising God, he's praising the people who stay together for joy and for pain and for joy. He even has an adaptation of the God full of mercy, the Elmalei Rakhmi, where he says, if God were not full of mercy, there'd be more mercy in the world. And he's sort of been hogging it for himself. So this is just a quick overview of how secular and humanistic Jews might approach the funeral process. I mean, you can see, looking back at all those traditions, that there are many things that could be of value to us. The idea of having time in the home for people to come see you, having people bring you food, it can be a very useful thing when you're not able to care for yourself in the same way. Again, having the funeral sooner rather than later might have a psychological benefit to it. Having a eulogy to remember the person's life goes back a long way. I find people even have meaning in that torn ribbon or the torn clothing of having a public demonstration of how they're feeling on the inside. It doesn't have to be supernatural to be evocative if it's symbolic. And we can draw on those choices. You might choose to sit Shiva for 7 days, and you're totally entitled to do that if that's something that's meaningful to you. So there's a lot of options that are available to us. In some ways, we get the best of both worlds. We can take what Jewish tradition offers for what value it still has for us, and we don't have to feel constrained by the Cohen rules or the requirement to mourn or not to mourn if you're in a certain category. I mean, you can't mourn your grandparents the way you want to. You can't mourn your mother-in-law, even if she might be closer to you than your own mother. No, that's not how it works. We're more flexible to open that door. And so when families ask about the ribbons, I say, whoever wants to wear a ribbon can wear a ribbon. I'm not going to stick on the rules of only those 7 relations can do it. So that's where, again, we can get the best of both worlds in saying goodbye.
I'll just briefly
Good
say that I
class.
think, yeah, excellent class. Thank you. And those ridiculous things that people say about there was a shortage of angels and all that, we have such a desire to fix things and to help people feel better. And it's so difficult for us to sit with someone else's pain.
Right.
That is why that's so critical. Part of it is to sit quietly with someone else's pain. It's very powerful, but also probably very difficult.
Right. Well, it reminds me of one of my favorite shows of all time is the show 6 Feet Under, which is about a family that runs a funeral home. So every episode is about a death and how the family's processing it. I found it really fascinating. In fact, I don't like generally seeing rabbis in shows because it feels like it's work for me. But the funeral home was enough distant that it's workish, but not me. But in the pilot for the show, I'm not giving much away, that the patriarch of the family dies and they have to bury him. And they have this little like dirt shaker. It looks like a big salt shaker, so they can shake some dirt on the grave, but not get their hands dirty. And one of the sons says, "No, this is not an antiseptic process. This is terrible. And we should get our hands messy." And he picks up the dirt with his hands and he throws it in the grave. And there's actually a tradition now in many Jewish families where they finish the burial themselves. They bring some extra shovels and the family themselves does the burying. And they keep shoveling until it's full. They don't use the bulldozer and they don't use the backhoe, and they do it themselves. And the first time I saw this, maybe 10 years ago, I was sort of shocked and surprised. I said, really? They're doing it themselves? But I really kind of like it. There's something about not outsourcing this responsibility and not hiring someone else to do this for you. Now you've got to get some starkers, you got to have some strong people to do this, and, and obviously gender neutral, whatever. But, so it takes a little bit of planning ahead of time. Otherwise you're there for a long time with the 2 people doing it. But it really can have that sort of cathartic, like, this is a messy thing. This is painful and we have to do it. There's also a wonderful rabbinic saying in the Talmud that says that the merit of a fast day lies in the charity that you do. And the merit of visiting a house of mourning is in the silence that you observe there. Simply going there and being quiet is what the merit is, not in talking and chit-chatting or talking about it's going there and being a presence. And yes, Kate's absolutely right. It's very hard to sit there and see people experience pain, but there's no greater gift we can give them in that time. And we do try to fix things. We do want to make them feel better, but sometimes letting them feel sad is okay. I mean, sadness has an evolutionary purpose. It lets us get out those negative feelings. It lets us we're tired at the end and we can rest and try to recuperate. And it creates a space for us that we need. And not mourning, not crying, not letting it out has its consequences too. So this is one of our gifts we can give, is to give people permission to feel what they're feeling. And sometimes it works really well at the beginning of a funeral to say, we're feeling a lot of emotions now. We're feeling anger at this loss. We're feeling sadness. We're feeling empty. We're feeling a little afraid. If it was after a long death, it's okay to name it. Sometimes we're feeling relief. Their suffering is over. We don't have to worry about them anymore. Not in the negative sense, like they're off the insurance, but in the positive sense of they're not in pain. They're not suffering anymore. And that's what we wanted for them the whole time. That's why they went to hospice. That's why we did all these things for them, to comfort them, to take away their pain. And their pain is done. And so it's okay to name that too, because sometimes there's a guilt that's involved. I feel guilty that I'm glad that she's dead and what? But in some ways it's a relief. And it's, again, an example where sometimes we're more humane with our pets than with our family. All right. Well, so next week we turn the page, actually literally, from life cycle events to literature. We're going to be talking a little bit about the earliest Jewish literature we have, which is the Torah. But again, looking at it not as a historical document and not as theology or philosophy, but as literature, because it's a book written by people. And one of the innovations that the Birmingham Temple put in place when they built their building in 1970, 71, was in their sanctuary, they did not put a Torah scroll or an ark. They put the Hebrew word Adam, which means people or humanity. And in the library is where they put the Torah scroll, because it's a book by people. Now, it is in a place of honor. You cannot check it out. It's on like extreme reserve, but it's with the other books as a book by people. And in my congregation, we go the other direction. We do have an ark with a Torah scroll, but we put other books inside the ark because our ark is wider and can handle the Torah treated as important literature, but literature by people nonetheless. So we'll talk more about that next time. Thanks for being here for our discussion on memorials and funerals. And stay warm. It's cold out in most of the country, certainly where we are here in the Chicago area.